Yes, you can be the rose between the thorns. Perfect.
You got it. There you go. You got it.
Yeah, I sent you right next to it. Oh, thank you.
Thanks so much for being here. You for being here.
Nice to meet you too.
Tony, I just want to come up and say hello. I know, but come see you. Thanks for being here. It looks like office. Yeah, it always is.
That's a little too close.
Tallest person in the front.
Hi, Tony. How's it going? Yeah. He said I was frightening. I'll wear that with a badge of honor. No, I'm not. I thought it was for me. Yeah, right? He was frightening. Right, yeah.
Right. That's right. I forgot that it was you. Oh, yeah, that's hysterical. That's even funnier.
Seatbelt, it wasn't you. judge that call. So they're going to do the pat down. I don't know which call is going to be the first. I don't want to read. You know, just have to take it.
Small airport in Northern California that has the 1980s metal detector glass.
And that's all they've got.
That's all they've got. So it's wonderful. It's wonderful. On the way back, not so good.
This one's the big one.
Self-imploding camera.
Check. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for Doctors for Accountability in Medicine and Media. My name is Del Bigtree. My background, I was a producer on the Emmy Award-winning television show, The Doctors. For 6 years, I spent my career celebrating the best that medicine has to offer, the best science, the best doctors, cutting-edge techniques, new surgeries. I'm a fan of great doctors and great medicine. While working on that show, I stumbled upon the story of Dr. William Thompson, the whistleblower from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention that came forward in the fall of 2014 to let us know that the CDC had been corrupted and that they were committing scientific fraud on their vaccine studies, specifically the MMR vaccine, the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine, and its causal relationship to autism. I made a movie about that, produced it, called Vaxxed. Actually, tomorrow will be the 1-year anniversary of the first premiere of Vaxxed. Yeah. That began a journey for me, as I think many of the people you're about to hear from today, that takes you out of what you believe was the foundation in truth and science, and specifically to vaccine research and testing. Once you start asking the appropriate questions about the vaccine program in this nation, and the one that really is promoted all around the world, you begin a journey that takes you to some very scary realities. These people here today represent some of the people that I've studied and investigated and interviewed for some of my research and the work that I'm doing. They only represent a handful of the many, many doctors across this nation and the world that are standing up now and asking for real accountability in vaccine safety, research, testing, and the promotion of future vaccines and those we're using on our children. I'm going to let them do the talking today because we live in a nation right now that wants to say the science is settled around vaccines. What that means is we're done. We're saying that we accept a vaccine program that this year will murder children. That's a fact. There will be children who will lose their lives this year to the vaccine program that would have had an otherwise totally normal life, could have gone on to become President of the United States or a future scientist with some great new breakthrough. They will not be here because of this vaccine program. Other children will suffer paralysis. Some will have their brains damaged permanently for life. And recently I've been asking this question of some fairly high up officials. And what I say is, how is that where we're settled? And they say, well, science has determined that that's an acceptable casualty. We have an accepted casualty in order to reach herd immunity in the United States of America. And so I follow that question with that statement with my own question, which is, please tell me how many children exactly are going to die this year from our vaccine program. Could you please tell me exactly how many children's minds will be ruined for their lives or will be paralyzed? And the answer you get from the mainstream medical community is, we don't have the data on that. So how do we have an acceptable casualty if we don't know what number we're accepting? I think that's the beginning of the first question anybody should be asking right now. So when we live in a nation that says that vaccines are safe and effective, which actually flies in the face of the highest court in the land right here in this town, the Supreme Court, which ruled in 2011, made the official statement, vaccines are unavoidably unsafe. I would like to know how the medical community stands in direct opposition to that statement made by the highest court in the land and repeats constantly, vaccines are safe and effective. That duality inside this nation between our medical establishment and the highest court in the land should be the beginning of a question that allows us to have true conversation, open conversation about the science of vaccines. If we cannot question science, then it is no longer science. It has become a religion. And much of the way this situation is addressed, this medicine is addressed, this vaccine program is addressed, is like a religion. If you question it, you are a heretic. If you question why there's a duality between the Supreme Court and the medical establishment, you are a heretic. We are the greatest nation in the world. We have the greatest scientists in the world. And I don't believe we should say the science is settled when lives will be destroyed by a program. We can do better. We must do better. And for any scientist that wants to say they have settled at a place where innocent children's lives will be destroyed, I say, please, step out of the way and let the future scientists come in and figure out a way to create immunity in our children, health in our children, that is safe and effective for every single child in this nation and around the world. And until we have achieved that, we must never, ever say we have settled, or we are no longer the greatest nation in the world. We are no longer the greatest scientists in the world, and we no longer have the greatest medical practice and institutions in the world. I think we stand here in the United States of America as a great nation, and these people that are going to speak today are going to move us into the direction that we need to go, which is open dialogue, scientific research, and getting back to the principles of true safety medical testing. So it's an honor to be up here with these folks. We'll have a question and answer period after every one of them speaks. And I also want to let you know, if you're with the press, beyond the people that you'll hear speak, we also have available to us today Catherine and Patrick Layton, who have gone through the issue of dealing with injured children themselves, and Mary Jo de Guzman and Jose Ramirez, who unfortunately lost their beautiful child within the last year to a vaccine injury. That being said, let us commence. To start out with today, I would like to introduce really a pioneer in pediatrics in many ways. Dr. Paul Thomas received his MD from Dartmouth Medical School and completed his pediatric residency at the University of California, San Diego. He is a board-certified fellow of the American Academy of Pediatrics, board-certified in integrative and holistic medicine, and a diplomat of the American Board of Addiction Medicine. He taught residents and medical students from 1988 to 1993, practiced at Westside Pediatrics from 1993 to 2008, and opened his own practice in 2008, Integrative Pediatrics, where he currently serves over 13,000 patients in the Portland, Oregon metro area. He's a founding director of PIC, which is Physicians for Informed Consent, a fantastic new group that's just come forward in the last several months. And he is co-chair for the Oregonians for Medical Freedom. He's the co-author with Jennifer Margulis of the Vaccine-Friendly Plan, Dr. Paul's Safe and Effective Approach to Immunity and Health, from pregnancy through your child's teen years, which is forthcoming from Ballantine. More than 260,000 people are subscribed to Dr. Paul's YouTube channel and or follow him on Facebook. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Paul Thomas.
Thank you, Del. I went to Dartmouth back in the early 80s, and all I recall being taught about vaccines was that they were miraculous. We eradicated smallpox, polio, and followed the CDC schedule. And for most of my career, the CDC and the Academy of Pediatrics seemed to be in the same closed-door room making the schedule that was then released each year, and we just simply followed it. What I found was, after I got into practice, well, let me take you back to residency because this is important. Doctors are trained to really believe that vaccines are one of the most important things we can do. And so we are really indoctrinated with that belief. And when I was in residency, I actually witnessed the introduction of the Hib vaccine. And at that time, we used to put needles into babies' spines to rule out meningitis several times a night. And I mean, I could do it with my eyes closed. There was so much meningitis. And literally, after that vaccine was introduced in it was about 1987, I experienced a drop in meningitis, and the data did show that. So I'm a believer. I mean, I go into the world, I'm going to make a difference, and vaccines was the way I was going to do it. Sadly, our children are not doing very well today, and I think the bloated vaccine schedule is part of the problem. I want to fast forward to November of 2007. I'm going to call this little guy Jack. I walked into what was supposed to be a well 2-year-old visit, and he was in one of those little push strollers, and the sun was shining in behind him, and his head was just going back and forth and back and forth. I mean, I can get a kid to engage. Jack, Jack, what are you doing? Could not engage him. I'd seen him at 1. He was completely normal. He was normal at 18 months. He was completely autistic. Remains so to this day. You would think that was a coincidence, but this was the 4th case in 4 years in my practice alone. And I didn't have a huge practice back then. I had probably a couple thousand kids. I was a very busy pediatrician, getting about 100 newborns per year, way more than most pediatricians got. So I was seeing severe autism in 1 out of 100 at that time. I already knew too much. It was not logical to be injecting a huge dose of aluminum with the hepatitis B vaccine to newborns who don't need it. And in fact, to this day, I haven't had a single mom in my practice, 30 years of practicing pediatrics, who needed that vaccine. So that routine vaccine is just totally illogical. It doesn't make any scientific sense. So with our kids being as sick as they are, 43% have chronic diseases now, and the biggest things are autism, ADD, ADHD, anxiety, asthma, the allergies, autoimmune things are exploding. I left my group practice and started integrative pediatrics, and I decided to implement what we should all be doing, and that's informed consent. Now the problem is, when you go see a doctor today, you're only being formed to the knowledge of that doctor. And sadly, most of our doctors, as Del pointed out, feel that vaccines are safe and effective, end of story. So that's the amount of information you're going to get. And so those of you who are parents who are watching this, you need to inform yourselves, because chances are you may not get adequate information from your doctors. So I instituted what ultimately became the Vaccine-Friendly Plan. We ultimately wrote this book, The Vaccine-Friendly Plan, just to outline that experience and to give parents a guide that was different than the CDC guidelines. But basically, this was no vaccines during pregnancy. No Hep B at birth. You don't need the rotavirus vaccine. It's a live virus vaccine that is making kids sicker than not. I have the data from my practice. The unvaccinated for rotavirus have much less vomiting, diarrhea, gastroenteritis, the whole thing you're trying to prevent with that vaccine. No Hep A vaccines. I have not seen a single case of hepatitis A in my career. A busy pediatrician for 30 years. Why is that? I live on the West Coast where there's supposed to be a ton of Hep A. Well, for children, it's a mild illness. We probably write it off as a cold or the flu. It's no big deal. And we wait on the MMR till after age 3. That was a fortuitous choice I happened to make, just gut feeling that vaccine was problematic being given early. Wait on the chickenpox till school age. And if you have any family history of autism, autoimmune disorders, severe neurological disorders, seizures, developmental delays, don't do any vaccines. The other thing I should clarify is that if you start to see any of those things, stop. That child is giving you an indication that this isn't going well, and that's something that's overlooked. So what did we find? I got an IRB, and we closed the data set in February of 2015, and we found that in over 1,000 kids vaccinated with the vaccine-friendly approach, there were no new cases of autism or autism spectrum. We had 238 kids who did no vaccines. They were the healthiest by far. The data sets I hope to get published in the near future. In so many parameters, the unvaccinated kids were by far the healthiest. And in the group of almost 900 kids who were most vaccinated, we had 15 cases of autism or autism spectrum. So that's a rate of 1 in 60. That fits with the going rate that's out there. The statistical significance of this, for those of you who are scientists, I know I'm not supposed to get scientific here, but it was a p-value of 0.00001. I mean, I haven't read a study in the scientific journals with that kind of significance. The chance of these findings being by coincidence is 1 in 100,000. It's just not going to happen. So I want to talk about a couple pet peeves of mine. One is pregnancy. I meet moms and dads and couples for prenatal visits, and usually it's too late. They have already been to their OBGYN, and they've already been vaccinated with a flu shot and a Tdap. They're trying to prevent pertussis. I get the idea. It's a good idea to try to prevent pertussis, but we lose about 5 babies a year in the United States to pertussis in the infant period, out of 4 million births. So we are injecting a toxic dose of aluminum every pregnancy in America to prevent 5 cases of death in neonates. Now, we don't even know if giving it at birth while you're pregnant is making any difference. We need long-term studies to look at that. Folks, this is insanity. When I point out a little bit of the aluminum data, you'll see this. You can go to the CDC website. When I give longer talks, I'll go through all the articles. I have reviewed every single article that's listed as a reason you should give the Tdap during pregnancy, and none of them look at long-term developmental consequences. None of them are looking at anything that matters as far as brain development. The flu shot, we have studies showing that it's causing problems. Gestational diabetes, eclampsia, and the study just published in JAMA this January, Journal of the American Medical Association. If you read the news quotes, it says flu shot safe. But go read the article. If you get the flu shot in the first trimester, you have an increased risk of autism in your infant. And we know the mechanisms of this. It's maternal activation. You cannot activate mom's immune system while that brain is developing and not cause problems, whether it's through natural infection or vaccination. So we have plenty of studies now that are explaining the mechanism of maternal activation of the immune system. My next pet peeve is hepatitis B for newborns. Every day in America, moms are signing in to have their babies in the hospital, not realizing that that signature is giving the hospital permission to do routine care. And routine care in America is the moment that baby's born, and you have just like a few minutes of skin time, hopefully, with mom and baby. The nurses take that baby over, dry him off, and stab him with hepatitis B, and less than 1/1000th of the moms have hepatitis B in this country. So that means 999 out of 1,000 babies are getting this toxic dose of aluminum for no good reason. Those of you who aren't aware, hepatitis B is a sexually transmitted disease. You catch it from sex and IV drug use. I kid around the hospitals that I round in, how many of your babies are having sex? Because the ones in my practice, they're not doing that. They're not even sharing dirty needles yet. I mean, the risk is zero, absolutely zero. I sleep like a baby every night making the recommendation not to give the hepatitis B to newborns who don't need it. And almost every newborn in this country does not need that. Make matters worse, the hepatitis B series being given as infants is not giving lasting protection. So when they do need the protection, when they're teenagers, they won't have it. Every single hepatitis B on the market has a ton of aluminum. I'm going to get slightly technical for you on the aluminum issue because this is important. We know that neurological problems, developmental delays, autism, all the horrible things we are seeing in our kids is due to toxins. It's toxins, toxins, toxins. The first chapter in my book deals with this. But the aluminum issue is especially problematic. Now, the FDA has said not to exceed 5 micrograms per kilogram per day. That's dissolved aluminum. We learned this from the studies from preemies who were getting hyperal. They would inject the feeding right into their veins because they couldn't eat, and figured out that, oh my goodness, when they were getting more than 5 micrograms per kilogram per day, they were losing developmental milestones. I mean, it was quite significant. So the FDA had this guideline, don't exceed 5 micrograms per kilogram per day. The hepatitis B has 250 micrograms, but that's not all dissolved. So the vaccine proponents who want to say that aluminum is safe, I'm just going to briefly get technical for you on this chart. This is the only one I think I'll go over in detail. On this axis is the body burden of aluminum accumulating in the body, and this is the child's age for the first year of life. And based on one study that showed it was safe to give 26 milligrams per kilogram per day of dissolved aluminum, they made these curves. So they're saying you can have that much aluminum in your body. If you exceed that, you're going to have problems with development. The issue is they ignored studies that show that you have problems with as low as 3.4 milligrams per kilogram per day. So when you redraw those lines, this is what happens every time you do aluminum vaccines. You can see that you are now exceeding, this is just the dissolved component of aluminum from what you get from your mother, what you get from your food, and what you get from your vaccines, these little blips. The entire first year of life, our infants in this country are in a level of toxic exposure for aluminum. The biological half-life of the injected aluminum is 7 years. And we give 10 vaccines that have aluminum in the first year of life, infants. 10 different vaccines. Now here's what people don't understand, and this is critical. The aluminum in vaccines is little tiny pieces of metal. They don't dissolve. They're called nanoparticles. They're small enough to be in solution, but they're too big to dissolve. So very little of the aluminum actually dissolves into solution. It goes into the muscle, and those of us who give vaccines, we see this every day. Redness, swelling, big reactions. What is going on? The body's immune system is saying, whoa, there's this foreign metal that has no biological function in the body. Aluminum is not used for anything. So our white blood cells, like Pac-Man, gobble up the aluminum, and white blood cells can do what? They can move through the body. So this is the way we transport aluminum to the bone, kidneys, and what? Brain. White blood cells only live 2-3 months. So they die, and they release what? Those nanoparticles of aluminum. It's a Trojan horse that takes the aluminum right to the brain. And that's what that graph over there, macrophages transporting aluminum to the brain. Now, those of us who deal with autism, I have in my practice of 13,000 patients, 300 kids with autism. Just this last week, I had a new family join my practice, 11-year-old twins, and they were severely autistic, barely verbal. And I said, well, tell me the story. Perfectly healthy, happy, interactive, starting to talk, 15-month-olds, got the MMR, regressed into autism. I have heard that story at least 200 times. You know, once or twice you can say it's a coincidence. 100 times, come on, something's going on. Well, aluminum is not in the MMR, so you're saying, what's going on there? Well, the MMR vaccine activates a protein, the MCP1 protein, and it basically moves aluminum around, and it's like pouring gasoline on the fire. So remember, we've transported the aluminum to the brain, and then you get that MMR shot. And I think this is a big explanation for why we see so many kids regressing after that particular vaccine. We're sort of loading the gun with all the aluminum, and then we're pulling the trigger with the MMR. It's really important to understand that brain development, I've got a little graph up there on synaptogenesis, it is exploding from birth through the entire early childhood. The synapses are forming, the connections are being made, there's synaptic pruning, and the myelination, the covering of those nerves, is happening as the child grows. So it is a critical time not to be messing around with our immune system and adding a boatload of toxins. Now, one of the most important things that's missing in the science today is this comparison of vaccinated with unvaccinated kids. So I shared a little bit about my experience in my practice. We have a real problem getting these sorts of studies published. So there was the Mawson study. I believe I have the data for you somewhere. Anyway, what they did was surveyed kids and looked at the various health reasons between vaccinated and unvaccinated. And what they found was for all the neurodevelopmental issues, allergies, autoimmune, asthma, significant increase in these disorders in the vaccinated group. We need more such studies. I mean, it's just so vital that this happen. So, Dr. Paul, this is a lot of information. What should we do? First, we need to let parents be parents. We need to let parents protect their children. You cannot protect your children if you're not given informed consent. Informed consent means you need to be told the risks, the benefits, and the alternatives. And one of the alternatives when it comes to vaccines has to be not doing it. Otherwise, you're not getting consent at all. It's mandated. So we cannot have vaccine mandates as what we are seeing in this country, and it's rolling out across the nation. This is total, unethical, against all ethics, the Nuremberg Code. It cannot be. Secondly, we need to allow We need a mechanism. We need a platform to allow researchers who are dedicating their lives to this issue a mechanism to get the information out there, because the information is being suppressed. We've got researchers like William Thompson, the whistleblower at the CDC. He was sitting on a stack of data, and he couldn't get it published. In fact, not only that, but his team had a trash can party to get rid of this data, and he decided no, and they changed the study design, and we're going to hear more about that. Heroes like Brian Hooker, who's going to follow me here today, who pursued this with a vengeance and actually published that data. I remember when that came out in 2014, and I'm so excited, and I thought, I wonder if this will stick. Sure enough, it's retracted. Okay, this is what's happening. We do not have freedom in our press. And finally, in the 1950s, we rejected the junk science of the tobacco industry, and we implemented massive studies comparing smokers and non-smokers. That decision saved millions of lives. We must do the same, comparing health outcomes of vaccinated and non-vaccinated children. We, the doctors, the scientists, legislators, researchers, and journalists, have the courage. We had the courage to do this before. We must do it again. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. You know, you hear things like that, and then you realize that that gets refuted by mainstream medicine by saying, oh, that's baloney, vaccines are safe and effective. That's it. Bumper sticker statement every time we get into this issue. You're going to hear more science, because that's what this is about. Science gets published, science can be discussed, science can be read, science can be understood. It does not fit on bumper stickers into simple little slogans. And I think that's part of the problem we're suffering from here in America. Next speaker, Dr. Brian Hooker, is an associate professor of biology at Simpson University in Redding, California, where he specializes in microbiology and biotechnology. He also teaches chemistry at Shasta College. Brian spent over 15 years as a bioengineer and the team leader for the high-throughput biology team and operations manager of the DOE Genomes to Life Center for Molecular and Cellular Systems at the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. Dr. Hooker also managed applied plant and fungal molecular biology research projects at the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. He served as research director for the plant biotechnology company Phytogenics, and is co-inventor of 5 patents, recipient of the Battelle Entrepreneurial Award in 2001, and a Federal Laboratory Consortium Recognition Award in 1999 for his work on reactive transport in 3 dimensions. The breadth of Hooker's over 60 science and engineering papers have been published in internationally recognized peer-reviewed journals. Dr. Hooker also has a 19-year-old son with autism, and it's my honor to bring you up here, Dr. Hooker, because your work has inspired and changed my life forever. It's an honor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for being here today. As Del said, I have a 19-year-old son who was injured by his infant vaccines, primarily his 15-month vaccines, where he received 3 vaccines, one with a live active virus, all while he had an ear infection. And very, very quickly, he declined into the world of autism and was initially diagnosed with autism, and then toxic encephalopathy by the time he was 2 years old. To this day, he is nonverbal, has very, very severe issues medically, and also has very, very difficult time in terms of understanding communication. I have studied the CDC since 2001. The CDC is responsible for vaccine safety. They are responsible for post-market surveillance of the vaccinations that are on the recommended schedule, which, by the way, the CDC, through the Advisory Committee of Immunization Practices, is responsible for putting together. That schedule at this point includes over 60 vaccines given to infants all the way through 18 years of age, and that comprises 15 different vaccine formulations. When I started to study the CDC, I was alarmed. I saw instances of fraud, malfeasance, data cherry picking, and I contacted the CDC directly starting in 2001, 2002. One of the scientists that I was directed to was Dr. William Thompson. At that point in time, Dr. William Thompson was very, very dismissive of my concerns, and in fact, at one point said, look, my daughter received all the same vaccines as your son, and she's fine. What's your problem? And to which I proceeded to take him apart scientifically. I couldn't let an opportunity like that go to waste. But in 2004, the CDC suspended any conversations that I had with scientists because of my son's status in the National Vaccine Injury Compensation Program. They said, in effect, I was suing the CDC, and so therefore I was no longer able to contact CDC scientists. As my attorney said at the time, I can contact any federal employee I want to at any point in time. However, the CDC said, yes, that was correct, but that the CDC would no longer answer my emails or my phone calls. So my only recourse was the Freedom of Information Act. And from 2004 to the present, I've submitted over 100 Freedom of Information Act requests, and I've received over 500,000 pages worth of documents from the CDC, all showing a pattern specifically in the Vaccine Safety Division to deny vaccine injury at all costs. Nothing to see here. Vaccines are safe and effective, and if a vaccine adverse event comes up, then dubious statistical methods are made to obviate that particularly strong statistically significant effect. In November of 2013, I again actually received a phone call out of the blue from Dr. William Thompson. We initiated conversations very soon after. We traded voicemail messages, emails, and then finally got on the phone in late November 2013. What I heard from Dr. Thompson in 2013 was completely different than the initial conversations that I had with Dr. Thompson. Dr. Thompson presented the CDC's Vaccine Safety Division as a conflicted agency that had no business researching or protecting the children, the infants, and the youth of the United States against vaccine adverse events. The CDC buys $4.1 billion of childhood vaccines every year, redistributes them from the state public health departments, and relies on reimbursement of those vaccines directly from the state's public health departments. They are a vaccine business. The CDC also holds 56 patents on childhood, infant, and adult vaccinations. They are a vaccine business. They are a vaccine company. They have no business stewarding the safety of vaccines in the United States. This is a captured agency. The agency is in bed with the pharmaceutical industry. Many of the representatives from the Advisory Committee of Immunization Practices hold joint appointments or receive money directly from the vaccine industry, and they have no business voting vaccines onto the schedule or evaluating the safety of such vaccines. One of the things that Dr. Thompson revealed to me very, very quickly was a specific instance of fraud concerning the MMR vaccine, and that is primarily the subject of the movie Vaxxed. And essentially what happened is Dr. Thompson was the lead statistician on that particular study. When he initially ran the numbers, he saw a strong statistically significant effect in African Americans who received the MMR vaccine on time, that was anywhere between 12 and 18 months of age, versus those African Americans who received the MMR vaccine after 3 years of age. The effect was so strong and so statistically significant that it could not be obviated. And Dr. Thompson himself said to me, he said, you've got to understand, when CDC scientists see an effect that they don't like or see an effect that would point an adverse event towards a specific vaccine, they get the scientists in the room and they work in the room until they can make that effect go away. Okay. In this case, they worked very, very hard to make the effect go away. They could not make the effect go away. And decisions were made by higher-ups, primarily Dr. Colleen Boyle, Dr. Frank DiStefano, and Dr. Marshalyn Jurgen Alsop, that they would take the offending data and they would, in September 2002, put this offending data in a trash can. They met on a Saturday in the afternoon, and they took all the information that showed the African American effect with the MMR vaccine, and they threw it away. Fortunately for us, Dr. Thompson retained an electronic copy of those records. Those records were then shared with me between November 2013 and September 2014. He shared tens of thousands of pages of documents that showed not only a strong statistically significant effect for the MMR vaccine specific to African Americans, and then my own research, I extended it to African American males, but also an effect in what we call isolated autism. Isolated autism is what my son has. These are children who do not have any type of prior comorbidity, any type of prior diagnosis. They haven't had any seizures. They don't have mental retardation, but instead, it very, very specifically and very, very quickly decline into the world of autism. What we would expect to see is regressive autism. Okay, and so there was a very, very strong statistically significant effect for the MMR vaccine for those children that received it between 12 and 18 months of age versus those children who opted to delay the MMR vaccine until 36 months of age. In order to get rid of this effect, they enacted a protocol which violated their original analysis plan. And in this protocol, they got rid of anybody within the cohort, within the study sample, that didn't have a valid state of Georgia birth certificate. So in other words, they cheated. They took the sample size of the original study and they reduced it by 40%. And those of us that do statistics for a livelihood and do epidemiology for a livelihood know that when you take your sample size and you make it smaller, you reduce statistical power. And that's exactly what they did, okay? They did it intentionally. The reason why they did it was not for the best protection of children in the United States. It was essentially to hide an effect. Okay. Dr. Thompson went on to describe a culture in which he could not publish research showing that thimerosal, the mercury-containing preservative that is still in the flu shot that is administered to pregnant women, causes tics in boys. That effect has been affirmed by 4 studies done by the CDC. The Verstraeten study in 2003 shows a strong statistically significant effect of tics in boys from thimerosal exposure. The Andrews study, which was funded through a funding decision made by CDC, showed the same effect in boys exposed to thimerosal in the UK. The Thompson study, which specifically looked at tics diagnosed by diagnosticians who were experts, who had been specifically trained in recognizing tics over a 3-hour interview period with children, also showed a strong statistically significant effect. And then finally in 2012, the BeReal study showed a strong statistically significant effect for thimerosal in boys. Yet, if you go to CDC's website, specific to thimerosal, specific to either thimerosal exposure in general or thimerosal exposure through the flu shot, it today says that the only type of reaction that you would get from a thimerosal exposure would be swelling or redness at the injection site. It is a big, dirty lie. And the fact that CDC has only looked at the MMR vaccine and only looked at thimerosal exposure rather than the totality of the vaccination schedule, rather than other exposures including aluminum, formaldehyde, and squalene, which are all additives into vaccines, which are poison, which are poisoning our children, is an indictment in itself. The only reason that the CDC looked at the MMR vaccine was because there was a downturn in the MMR vaccine due to the Wakefield paper in 1998. The only reason that CDC looked at thimerosal in vaccines is because Congress ordered them to in an act in the late 1990s regarding adding up the amount of mercury exposure in medicines, including vaccines. If they had not been forced to do this, we would not have this information today. We need robust vaccine safety. We need vaccine safety to be taken completely out of the CDC's hands, this conflicted agency, and it needs to be moved into an independent agency so logical, safe vaccine decisions can be made. And the best information, the best and brightest information, which is being censored in the scientific literature, as Dr. Thomas pointed out, can move forward. I've experienced this myself. I had a paper retracted. I stand by my results. The actual results will be republished in a book this fall called Controversies in Vaccine Safety by Elsevier Publishers. So hopefully that will go out. And despite my best efforts to make that particular paper retraction proof, I'm sure there will be rumblings to try to get that paper retracted too. Anything that goes out into the scientific literature that is against CDC dogma that vaccines are safe and effective is subject to retraction. Okay? And I call out to the press, please cover this information. Please expose this information. We need Dr. William Thompson to step forward. We need him to testify before Congress. We need him to testify before federal courts. And vaccine safety scientists and officials in the CDC need to be held accountable for the vaccine injuries, for the autism epidemic, for the epidemic of other neurodevelopmental disorders that have been caused by vaccines. Thank you very much.
I just want to point out and add to the fact that Dr. Thompson was the first whistleblower at the CDC exposed by Brian Hooker and then represented in my film. But since then, we have 12 more scientists in different departments in the CDC that came forward with a letter to all of media in this nation calling themselves SPIDER, dealing with the ethics of science, and making the claim that they are being forced to manipulate their data, change their data tables, and do whatever is necessary to protect the industries they're supposed to be investigating. That's an incredible claim. So now we no longer have just one whistleblower inside the CDC. We have 13 top scientists at the most important health agency in this nation and the world crying for help, crying for someone to come in and allow them to do the job that they believe in, that they want to do in protecting the American public. And what they are telling us instead, they are protecting the industries they are supposed to be investigating. So a real issue at the CDC. And I thank you for all of your work, Brian, in helping us bring that forward. Next up, Lori Martin Gregory is an independent, hold on a second, an independent journalist who writes about natural health and medical freedom for the Mom Street Journal and Health Impact News. She's a former investor relations consultant for Wall Street and was graduated with an MBA from Boston University. I'd also like to say that she's a third-generation journalist, fourth, with some very esteemed, powerful, wonderful journalists in her family. Lori, thank you.
Thank you so much, Del, and thank you to Physicians for Informed Consent for just being. When I was a child, I always wanted to know why. Luckily for me, my mother was very used to this line of questioning because my father was a newspaper man back when newspapers actually mattered. At the time, they were the only credible source of investigative work. That need to know followed me, and today I'm here to tell you that the search for truth is in danger. Not because we have less access, but because life is so full and we haven't got time to filter. Moreover, these little devices, while empowering in many ways, are constantly competing for our attention. Studies show on average you have 24 seconds to capture someone's attention before they click off of your website. Maybe that's why, despite the reputation that social media sites like Facebook have, even though they claim to be algorithming out fake news, still feature ads in their sidebar that are known as clickbait, that espouse breaking news that is untrue. A perfect example is a well-known post that you will often see on Facebook that will espouse that celebrities like Meryl Streep have been gone too soon, even though we know Meryl Streep's alive and well because she was at the Oscars this year. Fake news is the bait that often pulls us off track. Hear this well. Vaccine injury is not clickbait, nor is it a rainbow unicorn. It is very real. It's not just autism, and it's hiding in plain sight. This binder that I have with me today represents the cases of vaccine injury that were paid out in settlements through the U.S. Special Claims Court for 2016. It's released every year to the President of Congress, who's also known as the Vice President of the United States. This most recent report was issued, as it has been for the past 8 years, to former Vice President Joseph Biden. What's interesting to me is that none of the mainstream media are even paying attention to this report, much less reporting about it. I know this because this year the report, which historically is released in the second week of January on the U.S. Special Claims Court website, was late. It was only when I called the U.S. Special Claims Court in mid-February to inquire about the delay that the information was released on the website the next day. Granted, the report, which reveals for 2016 actually, that there's an 11% increase in vaccine injuries across the board from 2015. It went from 114 million in payouts to 127 million in payouts. That's for 1 year. It's cumbersome and it's labor intensive. That's because the report is issued on a scanned PDF instead of a sortable spreadsheet. So me, being foolish and stubborn, has to sit and go through and highlight all the cases in the 277 pages, and there's about 10, 11 cases per page, and then hand enter it into a spreadsheet. It's worth it because buried in these seemingly endless pages is gold. In 2015, there was a 400% increase in vaccine injury payouts to Americans, including a 1,188% increase in flu shot payouts alone. That's 1,188%. I'm certain you will agree with me that information like this is statistically relevant in the realm of public health. Yet to date, no one has reported this information because, sadly, it contradicts the messaging found in 70% of the advertising that is generated in mainstream media today, which is pharmaceutical companies. It's time for the Fourth Estate to rise up. We are an important component of democracy. Thomas Jefferson prophetically was aware of this fact. As a mom, as a journalist, as a wife, as an American, I implore you, members of the press, do not fall prey to the erosion of the boundary between truth and revenue. In an era where false news and truth are swirling in the same river, take a stand. Be brave. Challenge your editors and your assignment desk to go beyond the hijacked narrative of identity politics. Healthcare and industry don't always make for the best bedfellows, but it's up to you, the media, to inform the public about issues like vaccine injury. Despite whatever social propaganda or indoctrination narrative may have swayed the public from truth, it's up to you, the gatekeepers, to save and serve democracy from being a footnote in the annals of history. Thank you.
Thank you, Lori. Dr. Judy Mikovitz earned a BA in chemistry with a specialization in biology from the University of Virginia in 1980 and a Ph.D. in biochemistry and molecular biology from George Washington University in 1992. Upon graduation from UVA, she went directly to the National Cancer Institute in Frederick, Maryland, where she developed purification methods for interferon alpha. It was this interferon which was used in the first immune therapy treatment for leukemia. Her PhD thesis defense entitled Negative Regulation of HIV Expression in Monocytes changed the paradigm for therapeutic treatment of HIV. For this work, she was awarded the Graduate Student of the Year in 1991. In her 35-year career dedicated to developing therapies for cancer and AIDS, she has co-authored more than 55 peer-reviewed scientific papers and 5 book chapters, including seminal papers culminating at least a decade of research in each of 4 fields: immunology, natural products chemistry, epigenetics, and HIV/AIDS drug development. In 2006, Dr. Mikovitz became attracted to the plight of families with neuroimmune disease, including ME, CFS, and autism, and was primarily responsible for demonstrating the relationship between environmentally acquired immune dysfunction, chronic inflammation in these diseases. Judy, thank you.
How did I end up here? Well, 37 years ago today, the cover of Time magazine was Interferon, the Big If, Cure for Cancer. So it was a drop out of a needle, and this was, and I know it to the day because tomorrow's my birthday. So I was sitting at University of Virginia trying to figure out if I wanted to go work in oil with a chemistry degree or do something else. I saw that magazine and I said, that's what I'm going to do. I read an advertisement in the Washington Post to go to Frederick, Maryland and purify interferon. I got the job June 10, 1980, and that started this journey. Which is a wild one, but it's been fun. And so April 4th, 2016, this is the cover of Time magazine. And I'm going to read it. It says, "What if your immune system could be taught to kill cancer? Inside the brutally selective hugely expensive, life-saving trials of immune therapy. So 36 years of research in immune therapy. We know vaccines are immune therapy. They're designed to teach your immune system to respond to a microorganism, to a pathogen, according to its virulence. What is virulence? It's the damage to the host, the damage to the immune system. So when we think of HIV, when we were thinking of, when I did my Ph.D. thesis, HIV was incredibly toxic at the time because it destroyed the T cells, the cell-mediated part of the immune system. Not the Pac-Man, the primary immune response, the macrophage that that Paul Thomas told us about, but the adaptive immune response, how we produce memory, how we remember we saw an invader. This is what a vaccine is supposed to do. Teach your immune system how to respond with memory. And in fact, my PhD thesis was heretical at the time. 10 years, thank you. It was 11 years. And when we saw perfectly healthy young men at UCLA, around the world at medical centers, come in with a strange chronic infections that people don't usually see in the Western world. Kaposi sarcoma, a rare cancer usually only seen in old men in the southern tip of Italy. It's like, why are their immune systems failing when they're 20-some years old and perfectly healthy? At the time, we called it gay-related immune dysfunction. And I'm really ashamed of that because, I'm there and I'm 22, and we're going to AIDS meetings, and they're protesting the AIDS meetings, and the patients are saying scientists are murderers. And I'm thinking, well, your behavior caused this. You caused this. And, I've grown up a lot since then, but I saw a lot at that time. And now, so in 2006, when we spin ahead, we now know that, or even in 1983, we knew the etiologic agent, what caused this disease and this destruction of the cell-mediated immune response was a virus, was actually a pathogen that was transmitted through blood and body fluids, through at least theoretically. And so when we my PhD thesis was a week after Magic Johnson had been declared to have acquired the retrovirus HIV. So all my thesis committee cared about on November 14th, 1991 was, based on your thesis, will he or will he not die of AIDS? So I did my thesis here at George Washington University with taking blood from primarily black men with the virus and understanding how it stayed silent, how it could evade the immune response, because the most virulent organisms do the most damage by hiding from the immune system. And so to activate that, to activate the immune system is an extremely toxic thing which would spread the virus through the reservoir. So the answer was, based on my thesis, don't activate the immune system and silence the virus. You have to have both arms. Keep the immune system healthy and strong, and essentially you'll cure the disease. So now, 25 years later, we don't hear about HIV and AIDS anymore because the AIDS patients are healthier than we are. Yes, they're immune compromised, and so yes, we vaccinate them differently, and we keep them from from dying, basically, and turned it into a disease they can live with, just like diabetes, and that was our goal that I didn't think we'd ever achieve. So what happened in 2006? Well, we began to see children getting infections, getting diseases like shingles. And I called Dr. Arsetti, my mentor, and longtime adversary. And he said, don't waste my time. Don't be ridiculous. He was back at the National Cancer Institute in Frederick, and by this time I was in California. And he said, they'd be AIDS patients. And I said, yeah, exactly what I was thinking. And I don't mean HIV AIDS. What we've got is a generation, or perhaps two now, because it's been almost 40 years, of acquired immune deficiencies from environmental toxins, and the single biggest threat to our public health is the vaccines that went from 8 shots in 1983 and to almost 83 before a child is 18 or an adult at 21 now. So, science is never settled. And so what happened? Well, in 1986, Ronald Reagan signed the National Vaccine Injury Protection Act. And what that did was shut down scientific research. As we heard from Brian Hooker and others, any paper that is published that comes anywhere close to saying we might have a problem with vaccines, the data are destroyed. And I beg to differ with you, Del, as far as those scientists that are cowards. Dr. Thompson is a coward. We have an ethical responsibility to show all the data, whether we understand it or not. That's what I signed when I went into research. We don't hide any data. We publish it, whether we understand it or not. And when those data are retracted for political reasons, and not because the science has been disproven, that's a serious problem with all of our institutions. And that's where we are in science today. Major journals retracting papers. Retraction implies fraud. The fraud that's being done are the papers that are being published to cover up the truth. Knowledge and technology drives discovery. Discovery is how we change the practice of medicine. The difference between a Ph.D. and an MD is we're supposed to change the paradigms, which is why I made him read about those 10 years of study. Because each time along the way, we encountered science that was wrong. So we learned with people like Stephen Balin at Johns Hopkins that one of the ways the virus stays silent is methylation. Well, when components of the vaccine inhibit your ability to silence other pathogens, that's why you're activating the virus in HIV. So we learn, and yet we can't look at a generation of kids with acquired immune deficiencies and even implement the same drugs, the same things which cured Jimmy Carter's cancer. We can't use the same mechanism, brain tumor in a 90-year-old man, and obviously as you age, your immune system gets tired. We have the tools. We have the drugs. We could treat these kids now and prevent their death. Do we do that? No, we don't, because of a law that stopped solid research 30 years ago. In 1986. So we haven't taken advantage of anything we've learned. It removed all liability, not only from investigators who publish fraud, but from the manufacturers. They could put anything they wanted in one of these vaccines. So I think it's in your packet, but I asked, you can go to the CDC website and you can publish this table too, and it's the excipient list. That means everything else that is in that needle, other than the antigens that are supposed to be stimulating the immune system. I'll just read from the Pediarix, which we give 2-month-olds, formaldehyde, glutaraldehyde, aluminum hydroxide, aluminum phosphate, lactalbumin, I can't even read that one. If you can't read it, don't put it in the milk. Polysorbate 80, neomycin sulfate, polymyxin B, antibiotics. We wonder why we're developing antibiotic resistance. Yeast protein, calf serum. Think of any allergies, anyone? Fenton median containing bovine extract. Vero monkey kidney cells, which contain animal retroviruses, just like HIV, in our children. And then we continue for the next 18 years to activate those and hope they catch hold in immune cell with a long time memory. We are creating AIDS patients. So today I want to focus on my latest pet peeve, and that's the HPV vaccine. Human papilloma virus does not cause cancer. You know, hear this well. There are 100 strains of human papilloma virus. 4 of them are associated with cancers because they carry oncogenes. When we inoculate using those 4 strains, and with the potent and never safety tested adjuvant, the new form of aluminum sulfate, aluminum hydroxysulfate, and a lipid called MPL. Those 2 adjuvants drive the immune response as powerful as you can get to take an infection that is normally cleared 99% from the keratinocytes it infects at the level of the skin cell in 2 weeks. So the immune system, it's not a virulent pathogen. It causes warts. It's not an issue for 99% of the people who are infected. But when you bypass the natural immunity and inject directly into the muscles something with that aluminum, which carries it right to the macrophages, the microglia, the liver macrophages, the lung macrophages, and it stays there for more than a year, that aluminum. We give 3 doses of that, not me, in 3 months. 1 month, 2 months, 3 months. They did the research to show after the 2nd month, you were getting as much immunity as you would get, which is 4 years of memory, 4 years of protection. This vaccine was approved in 9-year-olds. It was never tested in anybody under 25. And yet the FDA, against everything we know about every cancer drug that's approved, took a multi-component vaccine. In cancer, we test them one at a time. Everything that goes into a patient for AIDS drug has to be tested alone and in combination. That's all gone. There's no safety testing. The vaccine is tested against the aluminum or against the hepatitis A vaccine, which we heard was one of the most dangerous vaccines we give today. And so you're looking, there's no placebo, there's no saline. So you're asking, if there's any more damage to the host. And you can't see the damage above the noise of the damage created by the very components of the vaccine that I just read off. And yet, it just flies. And most scientists like myself don't even read the papers. I didn't until Brian Hooker's paper came out in 2014, when we started understanding, wait a minute, now we're starting to understand those AIDS patients. So science, the journals are censoring the science. The journals are censoring the science. The journals are retracting. The journals are forcing those retractions based on politics, not on science. The papers are not being disproven. They're just pulled so nobody can read them. Fortunately, we have the internet. And I'll send you a copy of our papers anytime you want them, because the data are right and true, and unless scientists like myself can read it, we can't advance science. We're not even allowed to look at vaccine injury because of this law. So, did you know that Dr. Diane Harper, the lead scientist at Merck who developed the Gardasil HPV vaccine, warned vaccines causing permanent injury, even death, stating that the HPV vaccination leads to no benefit, only harm from injuries. Cervical cancer is not a public health threat. It's not an infectious disease. Why is it in the Department of Public Health? Why are we mandating every child over 9 years old, and I heard soon to be pregnant women, to get this vaccine? It makes no sense. They'll tell you, oh, we're going to be rampant with all these infectious disease. Well, that's not an infectious communicable disease. It's not a public health threat. It shouldn't be there. And yet, Doug Lowy, investigators at he's at the head of the NCI, National Cancer Institute, and CDC and FDA hold patents. And they're mandating something. They're making billions of dollars. And when we ask about that extra shot of Gardasil, it's so they can make more money. It's so they can get insurance coverage when we know that we don't need 3 shots to develop the same immunity. Worse, now parents will think their daughters, if they escape the devastation of the vaccine, their daughters are protected from cervical cancer. And so no pap smears, no preventative measures, no testing. And that only lasts 4 years, and it was never developed to prevent cancer. It was developed and approved to warts. Warts are not a public health threat. It's beyond, when scientists like myself, and I work in cancer and AIDS, hear this, Frank Rossetti just said, no, nobody gives a day-old infant hepatitis B vaccine. And we were 30 years old, and we worked with Ebola, HIV, and everything you can imagine, and we were given a choice. And it's mandated, and his wife even went upstairs and got their son's records. Fortunately, he was born in 1986. So what about the children who the luck of their birth were born after that? I recommended, to my sisters that their children get Gardasil. My twins, 3 boys, and my younger sister's daughter, who is in medical school, unfortunately didn't take my advice. That was a decade ago. I didn't know. I know now, but that one of the sons has migraines. It's just, we have to call for accountability. We have to call from all our public health agencies, the FDA involved as well, because they're the ones who are approving these things that haven't been tested. These are drugs. They're not magic Pez dispensers. They need to be considered drugs now. And I think we need to ban, as Japan and India have, all HPV vaccinations now, until the appropriate studies are done, until the patients are tested. We can get IRB approval. It takes a few years, and it takes a long time to do these multi-component studies, but they can do it if it's safe and effective. We can develop safe and effective vaccines. These aren't safe. More than 40,000 serious injuries last year alone. That's more than the cases of cervical cancer in the United States in any given year. Call all to that until any of these immune therapies, any of these vaccinations are tested alone and in combination in everything that's added to the schedule, we need to call for a moratorium on all vaccination. Stop today. Not one. There is not one thing on the schedule that is a public health threat in the United States of America today. In fact, that public health threat is the vaccines. We know the pertussis vaccine is driving the evolution of pathogenic species, driving the pertussis outbreaks we're seeing. The same thing's true of measles. The same thing's true of a cancer-associated virus. So HPV vaccination is driving the development of oncogenic strains, and we're not allowed to research any of those things. Scientists are simply not allowed. If you do, you don't have a career. So some people choose their career over their higher calling. I don't. We don't do that. We publish all the data, and we will. And I think we need to hold the scientists who are committing these crimes criminally liable. It's a crime to commit an ethical fraud and publish a piece of data you know not to be true. So, and until there's a full investigation, I'll talk to Congress anytime. I'll give them every piece of data that shows every bit of the head of the NIAID saying, if you do that study, if you show up and you show what you showed before, and you're not a coward and we haven't scared you enough, you will be arrested. You will be arrested. So that's the head of our National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases that is protecting an institution that pays out more than $6.25 billion every year in research for the 1 million people who in 1995 were infected with HIV and had AIDS. That translated into what we found with regard to the new family of retroviruses contaminating not only the HPV vaccine, but many of the vaccines because they're recombinant and they occur in the lab and they're in the biological materials, in the cell materials, the DNA, the cellular DNA that's in the virus. That's 25 million Americans with solid evidence of that infection, walking time bombs of chronic disease. We have to end this now, and I think the only way to do it is to stop right now. All moratoriums, when it hits the pocket, we're going to see the healthy people, and we're going to see something happen and research happen. Thank you.
I just feel so much better after that. Thank you for being a beacon of light and hope. Really shocking and powerful stuff. Thank you, Judy. Jennifer Margulis, Ph.D., is an award-winning science journalist, Fulbright grantee, and the author, editor of 7 nonfiction books. A sought-after speaker, she's been researching and writing about issues related to children's health for over 15 years. Her articles have appeared in New York Times, The Washington Post, and on the cover of Smithsonian Magazine. She produces audio features for Jefferson Public Radio, an affiliate of National Public Radio, and regularly writes cover stories for JPR's magazine, The Jefferson Journal. She has taught literature in inner-city Atlanta, appeared live on primetime TV in Paris, and worked on a child survival campaign in Niger. Her most recent book, The Vaccine-Friendly Plan with Dr. Paul's Safe and Effective Approach to Immunity and Health from Pregnancy Through Your Child's Teen Years, is co-written with integrative pediatrician Paul Thomas. Jennifer, thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Del. Thank you all for being here this morning, this rainy morning in Washington, D.C. So you already heard that my name is Jennifer Margulis and that I've been researching and writing about children's health for over 15 years. And I've written for hundreds of magazines, newspapers, and online websites. I've also interviewed scores of medical doctors and other health professionals, as well as families and nurses and midwives and everyone across the spectrum. And by and large, the editors that I work with are bold and unafraid. I went into a maximum security prison to interview a man who had been accused of killing his mother. And I also interviewed a caregiver who pleaded guilty to stealing from the elderly, while her boyfriend in the background was screaming obscenities at me. And in those instances, my editors have been there lock and step with me, supporting me and helping me and being unafraid. And in general, I think that editors and journalists are totally committed to telling about the real issues of our time, except when it comes to vaccines. When a journalist like me wants to write about vaccine safety or vaccine injury or specific financial implications of certain vaccines, we get hit with a wall of silence. Often our editors are simply baffled. There's so many things that they don't know. But often they also feel that it's too dangerous for us to write about it. So sometimes, and we heard a little bit about this, it's advertising dollars, and magazines and television has to take care of their advertisers. But in my experience, it's more often because the editors feel that we would genuinely be doing a disservice to the American public if we talk about issues in conjunction with vaccines, and that if some readers read stories like that, they would think that those stories were anti-vaccine, and they would think that maybe some people would choose not to get the vaccine, and then somehow that magazine or that newspaper would be implicated. There's a perception that if you write about things fairly and accurately, if we tell stories of doctors who have modified the vaccine schedule and who are enjoying outstanding results with their children, or if we tell stories of the parents whose children have been injured by vaccines, some of whom are in this room today, that we are doing a disservice to our children's health and to the health of our nation. But that is wrong. By not fairly and accurately representing both sides of the vaccine debate, we are doing a disservice to our nation's children. We have to talk about vaccine necessity, we have to talk about vaccine efficacy, and we have to talk about vaccine safety. If we don't, we are throwing a generation of children under the bus. Some of the editors who are older and lots of journalists who are brave and strong and who want to tell the truth don't really understand what's going on. They don't know, for example, that we have one of the most aggressive, if not the most aggressive, vaccine schedule of any country in the industrialized world. They don't know that we give a vaccine for a sexually transmitted disease to every newborn in America, regardless of risk. If your child was born before the 1980s, or if you don't have children, that's something that's not on your radar screen. You just simply don't know that hepatitis B is one of the vaccines that's mandated by states for entry into school. They also don't know that we're vaccinating for illnesses like rotavirus, which is a mild and common childhood illness that virtually every single American child gets by the age of 5. Many of you may not have ever heard of rotavirus because it's so benign for American children. That changes if you go to a different country and you don't have access to clean water and you don't have access to good medical care. But in the United States, children who get rotavirus do not have problems. And a lot of people look at me with surprise when I'm talking to older audiences. They don't even know that chickenpox is now a mandated vaccine. So the questions that we have to ask are all these vaccines really necessary? Is it safe to give so many vaccines to such small children? And is it possible that in our enthusiasm for an important tool in the medical toolbox that we've added so many vaccines to the childhood vaccine schedule that we're inadvertently doing damage to our children's immune systems and to their brains, at least to some children? So you've heard a lot of different science from a lot of different people, and there are several scientists also in the audience. And I want to tell you, looking at this from a bigger picture, that the most accurate answer to that question is that we don't know. There are more unknowns than knowns in this debate. But if we don't ask the questions as scientists and as responsible, brave journalists, we are not going to be able to find out the answers. These are not rhetorical questions. These are answers that these are questions that do have potential answers. And what we do know is very clear. We know that thousands and thousands of parents are reporting harm directly following vaccination. We're seeing that story over and over again. I brought a healthy child to the doctor. The doctor vaccinated my child. The doctor recommended I do Tylenol. 2 weeks later, my child got an ear infection. Then I did a round of antibiotics. And then my child's health started to slip away. You can't continue to call thousands and thousands of stories an unfortunate coincidence, because it's not. We also know that nearly every scientific study that has been done on Tylenol, that drug that I just mentioned, acetaminophen, has shown that it has neurotoxic effects. An article came out in a peer-reviewed journal just 2 weeks ago from Duke and Harvard University researchers doing a summation and an overview of all of the research on acetaminophen. And what those researchers are positing is that acetaminophen is playing a causal role in the explosion of brain disorders and autism that we're seeing today. And what are we hearing about that in the media? Very, very, very little, if anything at all. We also know, as you heard from Dr. Thomas, that the cumulative effect, the cumulative amount of aluminum that we are injecting into our children far exceeds federal safety guidelines. And one thing you might not know is that we give a vaccine at birth. We also recommend that every newborn get a vitamin K shot. That vitamin K shot also contains aluminum. It's inaccurate for journalists to portray this issue as a pro-vaccine versus an anti-vaccine debate. That is not what's going on here. I might be wrong, but I may be the most vaccinated person in this room. I lived and worked in West Africa twice in my adult life. I've been vaccinated for things like yellow fever that most of you probably haven't gotten. I chose to vaccinate my children. I, for one, am very grateful to have the option to do vaccines. My co-author, who's sitting here, Dr. Thomas, gives vaccines in his office every day. This is not about being anti-vaccine. Asking questions about vaccine safety and vaccine necessity and vaccine efficacy doesn't make you anti-vaccine. We all want the same thing. Whatever side of this debate you're on, whatever you think about these issues, we want the same thing. We want healthy children. We want them to have robust immune systems so that if and when they are infected with diseases, that they do not suffer from those infections and that they do not die from that. We do not want our kids to be suffering from autoimmune disorders, and we want them to have healthy bodies and healthy brains. But our kids in America are sicker and more brain damaged than they've ever been before. That's why we're here. That's why I'm writing about a topic that's really career suicide for a journalist. We're having this conversation because our kids are unwell. So doctors and scientists and journalists, I think, need to work together to press the government to form an independent vaccine safety commission so we can get to the bottom of this. We cannot let our bias or our ignorance get in the way of fair and accurate reporting on the issue of vaccine safety. So Anderson Cooper, who has dismissed parental concerns, dismissed evidence-based concerns about vaccines and vaccine injury, sent a team to Ashland, Oregon. In Ashland, Oregon, where I happen to live, there are many educated, smart, well-informed, community-minded families who choose to forego some or even all vaccines for their children. His cameraman, who came to interview that hotbed of anti-vacciners, right? His cameraman had had a baby 3 months before. I asked his cameraman if they had chosen to do the hepatitis B vaccine. He told me, you know what? We've decided to wait. So I want to ask you a question. Does the fact that Anderson Cooper's cameraman had chosen not to follow the CDC schedule for the early months of his child's life, does that make CNN a hotbed of anti-vaccine crackpots? Not all vaccines are safe for all children. We must do more detailed, more balanced, and more accurate reporting. I call on the American media to stop censoring this conversation and to start telling the truth about vaccines. Thank you.
I love that you mentioned career suicide. I think that we could officially call everybody up here the Suicide Squad. Okay, all right. Dr. Toni Bark received her M.D. from Rush Medical College. Following residency, she was director of the Pediatric Emergency Room at Mikovitz Hospital for 3 years, prior to returning to studies in naturopathic modalities and starting a private holistic medical practice. She completed her leadership in environmental and energy design in 2003 and a master's in medical science with a focus on medical disaster preparedness and response. Dr. Bark discovered serious conflicts of interest in the regulatory agencies and federal advisory committees, which propelled her to research, write, and eventually co-produce a documentary. I believe that's called BOT.
on the subject of corruption in big food and big pharma. Dr. Bark has testified in front of Senate Health Committees in Minnesota, Texas, and Vermont. She's an expert witness in a current case in the federal vaccine court. She's a contributing author to the second edition of Vaccine Epidemic. Dr. Bark has a private practice in the Chicago area and is co-founder of American Renewable Energy with her husband, Dr. Toni Bark. Thank you.
So I want to talk about the disconnect, because we've heard here from scientists and journalists about issues in vaccine program and in vaccines themselves. Why aren't we hearing about that from doctors? I hear all the time, I really like my pediatrician. I really like my general practitioner. I love my internist. They're recommending Gardasil. They're recommending the schedule. They're good people. They wouldn't do anything to hurt me or my children. Why is this happening? That's such a good question, and that really is the heart of the problem. I went to medical school. I started in 82, and I graduated in 86. I did it in 4 years. 86 was the year that Congress enacted the National Vaccine Compensation Program. There was also a program to report vaccine injury. It's called VAERS, Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System. I embarked upon a pediatric internship, 86, 87, and then I trained for a year in rehab medicine, and then I finished a pediatric residency. I never heard about the vaccine adverse event reporting system, which we're mandated to report if our patients have an adverse event. I never heard about the vaccine compensation program. I never heard that the head of the Wyeth vaccine program in 1983 wrote a memo going out saying we need to let training pediatricians know that the DPT can be dangerous for immature newborns, immature infants, and infants with neurological issues. This is a memo we need to get out. Never got to me. I was director of a very busy urban pediatric emergency room. I was recommended by the physician who was running it before me, who went to the University of Chicago. I didn't know about these things. Never heard about it. I saw vaccine injury. I never reported it. I didn't know I could. We saw kids in the vaccine clinic that would come in by ambulance in the evening, either in status asthmaticus, severe asthma, seizure, not just febrile seizure, sometimes complex seizures, and also respiratory distress or arrest. And we noted that it was likely vaccine-induced. In those days, we did not give anywhere near the amount of vaccines we give today. It was about 1/10. We didn't give a vaccine at birth. We adjusted for preemie age. We didn't vaccinate women who thought they could be pregnant within 6 months or were trying. This has all changed. Training doctors now don't even hear these warnings. I didn't get anywhere near the amount of warning and information I should have gotten, but I got something. I was told when I had chicken pox as a pediatric intern at the age of 26, and we had to vaccinate the whole ward with an experimental vaccine because I had exposed everybody, because I was forced to work with fever, because in those days you worked every day and through the night, every third night. There were no limits on hours, and fever was no reason to stop working as a pediatric or a resident. No, I'm serious, and this is important. I'll come back to this. Sickness, even communicable sickness, was zero reason to miss a day of work. That was very clear. I had 102 fever. I was working. And the day my titers came back, because I said, I don't think I ever had chicken pox, I was working the ER, and I was covered in rash. And I was told by the head of pediatrics, we have an experimental vaccine. We're going to have to give the cancer ward and the neonates because you had been on call working with them. But we would never recommend this vaccine to all children because all vaccines come with real risk. And chickenpox is a benign illness unless your immune suppressed on steroids, on chemo. So this vaccine will never be recommended. I remember that so clearly. And that changed. And I can tell you how that changed, but I'm coming there. Okay, so that's my background. You know, I'm walking around doing the vaccine clinic, vaccinating kids. I know there's a risk for some kids. It's kind of a Russian roulette, but, you know, this is what we do. This is what we accept. I didn't think about it. We were not taught anything about vaccines other than this is the schedule and this is how you give them and this is when you give them. That's the amount of information you get on vaccination. You don't learn anything about innate immunity in medical school. You learn about acquired immunity because you're taught to push the vaccines. That's what you're taught. Tylenol was given to every kid with fever that came into the ER before I could even see them. It's just a matter of fact. It reduces glutathione. We know that now. Glutathione is infinitely important in detoxification. So fast forward, I'm running the ER. I always wanted to do something alternative, but I loved emergency room. I thrive on epinephrine, I love emergency room. I love intensive care units. I moonlit. I was the only resident to moonlight as a NICU, neonatal intensive care physician before I even graduated residency. I loved it. I like procedures. I loved all that. But I knew going into medical school that I didn't like the idea of prescribing drugs when we can change lifestyle and diet. And that's how I was raised. My parents, thank God, in their 90s, amazingly healthy. They lived by that. I was raised by that, and that's how I wanted to practice. So I have a naturopathic practice under my medical license. I go for environmental training because I start seeing, it becomes very apparent to me that building materials, my husband's a builder, building materials and personal skincare things and air fresheners are all very toxic, and I wanted to study more. So I was the only physician at the time who got their LEED accreditation. I might still be the only one in the country, I don't know. And I started an organic interior design and build store and had my practice in it, and it was all about environmental exposure, that we're seeing changes. And about that time, I had been taught in med school in the 80s, everything was genetic. You're born with genetics, and that is going to drive your disease or health state. But really, what happened in the 90s was we had scientists who started seeing things were epigenetic. We have millions, thousands, I don't know how many, but several options for genes being turned on and turned off. And that is going to be related to our environmental exposure, which could be emotional stress. It can be chemical. It can be mechanical. But it's stress upon the body. It's exposure, heavy metals, organosolvents. All these things drive our epigenetics. And people are born with different genetic opportunities and different genetic SNPs, and those SNPs, meaning variations on enzymatic pathways, can be driven, turned on, turned off by things like heavy metals, by things like pesticides, right? So the world's getting more and more complex. We're seeing it in a more complex way. But yet, vaccine science is 50 years old. It doesn't take into consideration genetic variants, epigenetic variants, and exposure, and multifactorial exposure. Haiti happens. And I looked at the TV, and I looked at my husband, and I said, and I'm going to cry here, I can't not go. I can't not go there. I know how to run ERs. I know how to run clinics. I know that I can help people. I have all these alternative ways. There's no drugs. There's no meds. I need to be there. And I went 3 times. And the reason that's important is, of course, I enrolled in a master's in disaster preparedness and management, thinking I was going to be doing lots of Haiti responses around the world. And instead, I'm a reluctant anti-vacciner. I mean, this is really what catapulted me into what I'm doing today. I embark upon a master's at BU in disaster management in the graduate school, in the medical school, and a master's program in science. And they start modeling flu shot clinics, because you're a disaster manager. You got to prepare for this flu disaster we're going to have. And I do the research, and I come across an article by Peter Doshi, who is an editor at the BMJ. He's also a professor at UMaryland in pharmacy. postdoc fellow at Johns Hopkins at the time. I mean, this guy's not a slouch, okay? And I see an article he's written. And the article says in 2002, or 2 or 3, the CDC advertised 62,000 and something, almost 63,000 deaths from flu. Get your flu shot. And what does he find? Guess how many deaths were actually confirmed from influenza that year in the nation? Take a guess. 18. You're close. 18. Not 18,000, which, even then, that's still a far cry from the almost 63,000 he advertised. But it was 18. 18. What? Whoa. Okay, so I'm a physician. I've always looked to the CDC for guidance, like every other physician. And this is the point I'm trying to make, is that most physicians don't read every study. They read the synopsis, or they listen to the pharma rep who tells them what the synopsis is. And I'll give you a little soundbite from my film. The synopsis on Paxil. It's remarkable for teenagers and young adults. It's remarkable. That's what Dr. Biederman wrote for the makers of Paxil. If you read the study, you would find out that remarkable actually meant increase the risk for homicidal and suicidal ideation tenfold and increase the risk for mania fourfold. That's remarkable, isn't it? It's remarkable, but it's not quite remarkable in the way that most physicians who read it thought. And that's a problem, isn't it? So you want to understand why your pediatrician, who you like, and I always say, go to lunch with them. Don't let them take care of your kids. If you like the guy, go to lunch, play tennis. I don't know, but don't let them take care of your kids. They're good people. I don't believe that most physicians out there are on the take. I know they're not. I wasn't. I was adamant when people came in the ER and had zero. I was like, oh my God, you have 0 vaccines. We've got to get this, you've got to get going on this. And then slowly in my private practice, I was breaking them up. I wasn't vaccinating till age 3. I was doing mercury-free DTs, and I don't do any now. And so that was an evolution. So I understand those of you out there who came into this room thinking vaccines are safe and effective. I don't expect you to leave with a paradigm shift in your head. I had 20, 30 years to have my shift. It was an evolution. But I can tell you that when I discovered that Peter Doshi CDC, 63,000, we're a little off, it's actually 18. That really woke me up, and I started looking further. So I came across an Antelope Valley post-surveillance study for the chickenpox vaccine. And by the way, I called Peter Doshi, became friends with him. I called up Gary Goldman. Everybody, I wound up being in touch with Diane Harper on a regular basis. Thomas Jefferson, head of the Cochrane collaboration. I mean, everybody in my graduate school who wrote a paper or had a document, or I heard a snippet and I was curious, I called them. This was firsthand. I wanted firsthand. No more listening to CDC. I want to know firsthand by these researchers what the hell is going on. And I just censored. I would have said something else. So I hope hell is okay. And Gary Goldman has an amazing story, if those of you don't know him. Gary Goldman was an epidemiologist for the health department in California. And he was hired by the health department and the CDC to do a post-surveillance study for the chickenpox vaccine. And he did. And he found out that chickenpox was in fact reduced. However, shingles was on the rise. And that had been predicted, by the way, by 2 sets of mathematical biologists in the U.S., Heathcote and Judy, who I interviewed, because of the way our immunity is. Because what happens is that we get chickenpox as kids, aside from me, who got it at 26, but most people get it as a child, and then they're repeatedly exposed. Every few years, it goes through the community, they're repeatedly exposed, it boosts their immunity. That is normal. That's how it's supposed to work. And when you take chickenpox out of the equation and you're no longer exposed as a community, guess what happens? You get reactivation called shingles. which is infinitely more costly to care for and more lethal. And the chickenpox vaccine had been marketed for $1. Basically, it was save money because parents lose so much money yearly caring for their kids with chickenpox. This will save parents money. That's how that vaccine was marketed. What happened to Gary Goldman when he made his discovery? He received a cease and desist letter from the health department. You can't publish the second part of that paper, they told him. He hired a lawyer who said, oh, yes, you can. And under Freedom of Information Act, anyone would be allowed to get that information because it was taxpayer paid for. So he published it in the Journal of Vaccine, which would never happen today, because guess who's on the journal? Who's the chief editor-in-chief for the Journal of Vaccine today? Thank you. Yes, our leader in vaccinology from the Mayo Clinic. This is what's happening to journals today. So journals that were truly academic journals, where you could publish real papers, suddenly pharma made sure that the editors-in-chief to these journals were people working for them and doing research. And that's who's the editor-in-chief of Journal of Vaccine today. And we know about it in an article written by friends of mine, very good paper, research paper on HPV and Gardasil, that was retracted by Gregory Poland 8 months later after it had gone through rigorous peer review. So why don't doctors know what's going on? Maybe the journals have editor-in-chief that have undue conflict of interest. The advisory committees, this is what really got me. I started looking at the advisory committees because I didn't know how vaccines get approved and then recommended, so I did a little research, and Peter Doshi helped me. And so it goes to the FDA, and there is a committee there, and everyone but one person works for the industry. So that vaccine committee to approve the vaccine has one person that they call the consumer representative. Then it goes to the CDC's vaccine committee, where, now there are laws called Federal Advisory Committee laws, and that's the FACA, Federally, I'd like to say something else, but it's Federal Advisory Committee Act. And on the CDC website, they actually say that they grant a waiver to everyone on their vaccine committee because they want experts in the field. And I went, really? Shh. This is part of the problem. I had no idea. I did not know that the vaccine compensation program existed until my 2010 embarkment upon my master's. I'd never heard of VAERS. I'd never heard of the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System. And guess what? Most doctors have never heard of VAERS. And I'm talking about pediatricians too, have never heard of the vaccine compensation program. They've never heard of the table of injuries. You know what that is? So the table of injuries is when the vaccine compensation program was created, they worked with the National Vaccine Information Center, the precursor to that, Barbara Loe Fisher, thank God for her. And so they created this table of injuries. So if you got the DPT, which we now know kills 5 kids to every one it saves. That was just published by Peter Abe, 20 years of research or more. Peter Abe and a whole team. The WHO has sent people to make sure that this is valid over the last several decades. It was published. This is valid. 5 kids die for every one we save from D, P, or T because of what it does to the immune system. So you're more likely to die after getting that vaccine because your innate immunity is not working well. So you die from other causes. That's very clear. This has been studied over decades. But at the time, the DPT was the #1 reason that people sued the pharmaceutical companies. And so there was a whole group of parents just boycotting the DPT and just going to Congress, lobbying to Congress to do something about this. And what was done, which we thought at the time was good, was a table of injuries were created. Your child got the DPT. They either died, they got encephalitis, they became autistic or retarded. You don't have to go through a provation. You don't have to prove the causation. That is on the table of injury, and you automatically get awarded what it is. So if it's death, it's actually not as much, as we all know. It's capped at $250. If it's lifetime injury, it could be in the millions because you have to figure out how costly it is to take care of that child. But what happened when they started adding more and more and more vaccines? The table of injuries was not kept up to date. And so the reality is that parents have to prove cause for the most part. Not only that, most parents don't know about the table of injuries. They don't know about the court. And by the time they hear about it, the statute of limitations is up. So while the government says that probably only 1/10 of vaccine injured parties apply for compensation through the program, I believe it's more like 1/1000th. That's probably the real number. And I know that because I now work in the vaccine court. I'm an expert witness, but I'm also an expert witness for vaccine custody cases. Can you imagine what that is? Anybody have an idea what that is? Yeah, and it's usually a parent against a parent. And it's usually the moms don't want to vaccinate and the dads do, but I've had cases in Australia and here where it was the opposite. But I've won. And cases that have gone to trial, we win. And why do we win? Because when we get to court, unlike in a New York Times article or a Slate article or a journal that retracts a paper, I get to present data and evidence. That's why we win in court. And guess what? The experts on the other side don't know anything. They don't know anything. They've never heard of VAERS. They don't know what the table of injuries is. I love these closed hearings because in the closed hearings, they don't get to hear my testimony. And when the lawyer for our side interviews them, they don't know anything, and it's very clear they don't know anything. And that, thank God for that. Because if they did know something, they probably wouldn't be standing there testifying on that side of the aisle. They would have come over to our side. Because you don't go in the other direction. Interestingly enough, doctors who start learning, as I call it, falling down the rabbit hole, because it is an endless hole, and it can't get any worse. Yes, it can. Yes, it can, and it does. When you fall down the rabbit hole, you don't go back, because you can't unlearn that. You can't unlearn all the corruption stories. I had a list of corruption stories for you today, but I don't know how I'm doing on time. But I got to wrap it up. So, okay, let's just say there's a whole host of other stories like Gary Goldman's cease and desist letter. And I'm just very quickly, we've got CDC in 1991 with Kaiser Permanente experimenting on inner city black children from the Watts neighborhood, giving them an experimental measles shot at 10 to 500 times the dose, not informing the parents it's an experiment. Having a death, having to stop. One article, one newspaper, LA Times. The LA Times was the one paper. Interviewed the then head of CDC, who's now deceased, and he said it was a mistake. Really, a mistake? It was pretty well planned out. That's not a mistake. It's a mistake they got caught, right? They were doing it with Johns Hopkins in Guinea-Bissau and Haiti, and there were deaths there too. Okay, that's no mistake. That's what I call crime. That is a federal crime. No one took them to task to this day. And I am now still working on this, trying to break it open, looking for parents, looking for these kids who are now in their late 20s, and I'm going to see what their health looks like. We're going to see who's neurologically normal. Because I have a feeling not many of them are. 10 to 500 times the dose of an experimental vaccine and not informing the parents that it's an experiment, not an approved vaccine. Shame on all the press that didn't cover that. Shame on them. Shame on all the press that didn't cover the CDC numbers of flu. I mean, I get it. I understand that in any non-election year, 70% of all advertising dollars is pharma. I even understand that for public TV and public radio, that it's foundations that give grants, and those foundations are front groups for pharma. I get it. But how long can we be bullied by an industry? It's affecting you guys. I'm seeing second and third generations of kids whose parents were vaccine injured, have their own vaccine injury stories, so sick. They knew not to vaccinate their kids. Their kids come out damaged already. with high levels of heavy metals and antibodies to their own brain, probably from the squalene or the aluminum from their parents. And every time I choose to test for antibodies to brain receptors, they're positive in all these kids. We are damaging whole generations of children. Who's going to pay for this? This is not sustainable. This is absolutely an unsustainable situation that we're in. So thank you. We have to be out of the room. So thank you so much. I'm sure it was uplifting.
I know we promised a question and answer period, but as I said before, real science doesn't fit on a bumper sticker. I want to thank all of these esteemed scientists who just gave you a lot of information. I hope at least planted a question inside of you that helps you begin your own journey.
We have time for Q&A.
We have time for Q&A. All right, so yeah, and outside of this room, if we don't get to stay, all of these people will be available to questions. I just want to say in closing that my experience and my research as a medical journalist has brought me to many of these conclusions and many more. But I want to talk about the things that we would say on a medical talk show, The Doctors. Here are the numbers in the United States of America I find shocking. We have more babies dying on the first day of life in the United States of America than every other industrialized nation combined. In fact, we have 50% more than every other industrialized nation combined dying on the first day of life. Think about the greatest medical system in the world, which we have, and the best doctors in the world, which we have. Why can't we keep our babies alive on day one? I would say we should be looking to the fact that we're giving a hepatitis B vaccine that's been spoken about today on that first day. Move it to somewhere where it would actually be appropriate when a child's about to start having sex or maybe sharing needles, and let's see what happens to our day one death rate. Roughly 1 in 2 children in America now has a chronic illness. 1 in 4 children is leaving elementary school on a drug they are going to be on the rest of their lives. And we've said on The Doctors, a medical television show, all the time, this is the first generation of children in America that is not expected to live to be as old as their parents. So when we hear this statement that medicine has prolonged life and helped us grow older, that was true until this generation. We are doing something wrong. Vaccines are probably not the only cause of toxicity and illness, but it is certainly the best delivery system for some of the toxins we're trying to keep out of our water, our air, and our food. We must do better. This is the greatest nation in the world. We have the greatest scientists in the world. And if we could be allowed to have open discussions, which is what science is all about, the foundation of journalism and the foundation of science is exactly the same. We must always continue to ask questions, especially the hard questions. If we stop doing that, that is not only the death of science, but in the case of journalism, as Thomas Jefferson said, that is the death of democracy and the death of freedom. Have we gotten that extra 20 minutes, or are we moving out of the room? Okay, well, let's go ahead and take a couple questions while we're here until someone kicks us out. I think we have a microphone here I'll pass around. Let's see. Yes. Just go ahead and say it out loud, and I'll repeat the question.
Oh, okay. Well, my name is Dr. Diane Powell, and I'm an expert on autism.
Okay.
And 30 years ago, I was with Sir Michael Rutter in London, basically to learn how to distinguish between a child who stops talking for, social reasons versus medical reasons. And I was told, I trained at Johns Hopkins, went to medical school there, and trained in psychiatry there. And I was told when I went into academia at Harvard that I would not have a career in autism because it was so rare. And so I instead devoted my career to Alzheimer's and dementia. And I got back into looking into autism about 10 years ago when I saw the numbers going up. And there are several pieces of this conversation that have not been included today because most people don't have the knowledge that I have, and I'm happy to talk to the press about it. One of the things that we do need to know is if you look there at synaptogenesis, anywhere when anything goes wrong in that that is considered a neurodevelopmental disorder. And what is happening is that children, after they are born, they have their immune system inside of their brain. So we found out that about 10% of the cells in the brain are actually immune cells that get activated by chemical messengers from the periphery. They get activated because they play an instrumental role in the learning process. They're trimming back the synapses that are not supposed to be there. Well, what happens when you activate that immune system in the periphery? You're activating those immune cells. And so what's happening is that we're having children who are not only medically ill, but we have about 25% of kids in kindergarten who feel suicidal because their brains are so inflamed. And why is it that they all are getting labeled autistic? They're getting labeled autistic because the ages at which they are having their neurodevelopment disrupted are the times when they're learning to be social and they're learning language. So it's no big surprise that that part of the brain gets attacked. But there are many, many reasons why this is happening now, and I'd love to talk to people about it. Thank you.
And in puberty as well.
Yes, exactly. That's right.
That's when all the growth, that's when all the empathy, that's when everything of the higher function develops.
Boys are more prone to this because testosterone activates the microglia. And so so we are at most risk during the first 4 years of life if you're a boy, and then when you're at pubescence.
My case in the vaccine court, it was a normal 11-year-old who moved into this country, and the parents were told they had to give her a chickenpox shot to go to junior high. So she's normal, high intelligence, very talented. And she developed autoimmune encephalopathy, which was missed by all the children's hospitals. I'm the one who sent the blood off 3 years later and found that. However, she now tests an IQ of 90. Well, when she came to me, an IQ of 90 was diagnosed with Parkinson's. She is getting better. We're doing all kinds of medical treatments, and she's improving. But that was 3 years into her injury. So this was an 11-year-old that we saw regress. So you're right. The key developmental times really make a difference what happens to the brain.
And so it's critical that you did Alzheimer's research because all of the pathways are overlapping. So not only Parkinson's, ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease, myalgic encephalomyelitis, that's the teenage girls, the muscle and brain inflammation. It's on and on. The list is 33 diseases, including 8 to 10 cancers, breast, prostate, ovarian failure in these kids, in these teenagers, with Gardasil in particular, but with all vaccines. You don't vaccinate anyone in puberty.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes.
My question would be for Dr. Margulis. You talked about the politics and why we get here. Dan Burton, as the chair of the House Oversight Committee, who's now Mikovitz, he has the whistleblower documents. Before that, he's a minority guy. His grandson got banged in the head by this crap. He's been fighting it for 2 decades until he left office. What is it we're up against? These people can screw us to the wall like this year after year after year and get away with it. Who are these people?
Yeah, you could. So just for those that didn't hear, Dan Burton, you're asking, who was on the Oversight Committee of Government Reform, where Jason Chaffetz is, he would be the one that would have to subpoena Dr. William Thompson. The question is, he had an injured child. We had someone very high up in politics, was asking all the right questions. Why has that essentially gone nowhere? What are we actually up against, I think is the question.
So I want to answer that from the point of view of why journalists aren't covering it. I think that's why you're directing that question to me. Or, I mean, here's what's really interesting. You know, I've interviewed scientists at absolute name brand universities who say, I agree there's absolutely something going wrong with this vaccine schedule, but I would be ninja kicked out of my position. And these are tenured scientists who say that if I spoke publicly about that. And then I sat next to an editor-in-chief of one of the most important newspapers on the West Coast, and we had a kind of a heart-to-heart conversation about it. And this editor said to me, that's what happened to I don't have children, but that's what happened to my nephew. I know that something is wrong. You know, yes, send us an op-ed, which then took, 4 months to get published. And I don't know how much push that editor had to do in order to get that. It was an op-ed that Dr. Thomas and I wrote about. Basically, one of the messages that we have to the world is that people who have concerns about the vaccine schedule are not crackpots. Because, I mean, you know, what we're seeing, that there was the title in the New York Post that, of course, went viral, and it was, "I was an anti-vaccine crackpot." And that could have been written as a pharma script. But, you know, what you have to understand, and what I think comes out in both of the amazing documentaries that have been done here, is that there's a huge amount of money to make sure that this information doesn't get out. So many people have so much to lose. The truth is, we all do want good health for our children, but we have one pharmaceutical company that spends over $900,000 a year on PR that's undisclosed, in the sense of they're hiring people on Facebook, on Twitter. They're tweeting right now, "Look at that baby killer, Jennifer Margulis." You know, that's happening without disclosure. So it's very difficult because we're up against a broken system. We need to fix the system, and I think the first step is to ask for honesty and accountability.
The other issue is, and I interviewed a whistleblower in my film who opens up by saying, so he was a state fraud investigator for the state of Pennsylvania, and he was fired for investigating state fraud because he was told, "We don't investigate pharma. They pay both sides of the aisle. Stand back." Okay? So when you have committee leaders, you know, who, if you look at how much money they're getting from pharma for their next election, how much they got from last election, doesn't matter which aisle they're on. You know, I don't know who watches Veep, or, you know, I mean, there's some truth to that. Like, you know, 90% of the time, I think a lot of our politicians are basically just trying to acquire money for their next election. And why is it that when we go to meet with legislative people, it's the staffers? If we had money for them, I said to my husband yesterday, we should call ahead and say, "We have a bag of cash for you. We have a bag of cash. Maybe you'll meet with us now." Because that's honest. I mean, unfortunately, that's the reality. It's expensive to run for office. I think that's the problem. I think the problem is that in order to run for office at the state level, and the reason chickenpox got mandated at the state level was Merck paid legislators $15,000 a day for the day, and we have a legislator who couldn't write good notes, so she went twice in Illinois, and to listen to their spiel about the chickenpox vaccine, and then they turned around and pushed the bill to mandate it for school. That's how that vaccine that I was told would never be mandated got mandated, and that is how it happens at the state level. But it is so expensive to run for office at the state level, at the national level, that without pharma dollars, it's not happening, and that's the problem.
So we do have small victories, and I have a little bit of a interesting tape because I used to do investor relations on Wall Street for biotech and pharma. And what we've seen in New York and in California is, and some people in this room that were very instrumental in putting that in place, we have mercury laws that prevent mercury-containing, thimerosal-containing vaccines from being injected into humans. Those laws have been exempted almost every single year during flu season since they've been on the books. Most recently, in 2015, in New York and California, and in California, where I live, it was in the name of a shortage by the manufacturer of the non-thimerosal-containing flu shot for pregnant women and infants 0 to 3 months, because Sanofi Pasteur was having a shortage. Well, I called Sanofi Pasteur, and guess what? They gave me in writing 3 weeks later. We have no shortage of the non-thimerosal-containing flu mist, flu zone vaccines for pregnant women and infants 0 to 3 months. We're shipping on schedule. So what did we do? Me and my Mama Bear Warrior activist friends in California, who have to homeschool now if we don't want to give our kids 1,000 vaccines, we sent a letter to every single legislator in the state of California and Governor Brown saying, how can this happen? How can we be exempting this law that was put in place to protect us? Do your job. Do you know how many we heard from? 0. Do you know how many reporters from the LA Times returned our phone calls? 0. Do you know what happened the next year? Last year's flu season? In New York, they exempted the law again, but we didn't send a letter in New York. They didn't do it in California. They didn't do the exemption. That's a little victory. It's a little victory, and we got to take it where we can get it. Because people that are running pharma didn't make this problem. They inherited it. So if they continue to be complicit, they're guilty. But we have a chance right now in Washington. We have a climate like we've never seen that is receptive to the concept of vaccine injury. And so we have to take the victories where we can get it. We have to bring change. We have to remember that they're only people, and we all love babies.
I was going to add to that. I wrote a letter to the American Academy of Obstetrics and Gynecology, and I asked them, why are you recommending the thimerosal-laden flu shot? Why won't you recommend mercury-free flu shots? And they said, we don't believe mercury or thimerosal to be toxic. And I sent them a picture of thimerosal from the manufacturer, which has a skull and crossbones on it, and I sent them a copy of the MSDS data sheet, which is the safety data sheet. And it said it is a mutagen for mammalian somatic cells, which in plain English means it can cause birth defects. Right, and cancer. And they said, well, we believe it to be GRAS, generally regarded as safe. I said, but based on what? That we regard it to be GRAS. And that is the same answer I got from Dr. Robert Cedar at the NIH, who's head of the aluminum adjuvant division. He told me that we at the NIH believe aluminum to be GRAS. And I said, but the FDA doesn't and the EPA doesn't, and I can send you tons of literature from Peter Exley at Exeter College in England and from Chris Shaw and Lucia Tomlinovich on the dangers of aluminum. And he said, well, we believe it to be GRAS. I'm like, okay, this is like a circular broken record. I mean, this is a broken record here. Like, I mean, are you not educable? You know, like, what is your IQ? Is it below 70? I don't understand. And I sent him numerous articles and heard nothing back. He still believes it to be GRAS.
Offer a suggestion. Next time, Tony, tell them to practice religion on Sundays and do their job during the week, which is science. It's not about what they believe. It's about what is true and fact.
Right.
Did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to offer a slightly different perspective. I started off by trying to tell you all how dedicated I think the editors and I work with are, and the journalists I work with are. I think, honestly, they don't know and they don't understand, and on this issue they are running scared. They're running scared because they honestly believe that we would be doing a disservice to our nation's health. And it's not in the case of, like, you know, I work for nonprofit newsrooms, they are not bought. And they have said to me, I mean, we have done investigations, for example, when the state was withholding access to maternal care when women wanted to have home births, whereas the state of Oregon, absolutely, women can choose. Low-income women had the right to choose where they wanted to give birth, and the state was taking that right away. And we went after the state of Oregon, which was the biggest donor to our news organization. So it's not that, and that's brave, and that is really putting your money on the line and saying it is more important for us to protect the integrity of birth choice than it is for us to go along and take this money. And I really do believe in, maybe I'm being naive, but people who do investigative journalism and editors who really want to tell the issues of our times, they are committed, and they aren't bought in the way some other people are, but they have unconscious bias, or they have overt fear that they do want to do something. They're ready to speak out. They want to talk, but they don't know how. And, every single narrative we hear everywhere is contradicting all of what we're talking about. And we're talking about hard science, and we're talking about nuance, and we're talking about complicated, multifactorial, causes of autism. And those are hard to put into sound bites. And, we need leaders. I mean, I think Del Bigtree has done more to push this conversation forward, even if it is on the new media. And we need 15 more Del Bigtrees to stand up, and we need the ones who are writing for the Washington Post and the LA Times to come forward, many of whom follow me in order to attack me, you know, in sort of stepping out of journalism and being really nasty. And I would invite any single one of those people. I am open. I will talk to you. I will talk to anyone with any preconceived idea about this issue, and let's sit down and have a conversation. Let me show you the science I think you should read. Go read it and make the decision yourself.
I had to jump in on this just because I think that there are different ways to look at this. But one of the things I've experienced with Vaxxed is a total misrepresentation of what we would call a review. I don't know why that's happening. And I've had, I live in Hollywood. My friends are all producers. And so early on, I said they're not writing the truth about the film. They're not talking. I don't even think they've seen it. I mean, they literally did not appear to have watched the movie. And I'm talking about Washington Post, New York Times, like major writers that I've respected and reviewers I've respected wrote some fake review of my film. And I had a friend that really challenged me. He said, come on, Del, you got to be kidding me. You know what I mean? I get it. You got a bad review. It sucks. It happens. Welcome to the world. I said, well, I want you to read the latest review. Here you go. And I want you to come see the film. And afterwards, he was in shock and said, what the hell is going on? You know, what is going on? How is that possible? How can a mainstream media outlet don't cover the film, but how do you write a fake review about what the film was about and not have actually mentioned Dr. William Thompson or fraud at the CDC? They will say the film was about Andy Wakefield in the Lancet paper. I mean, you clearly didn't watch the film. So I think what I would agree with is that there are journalists throughout our media system that want to cover this story, that have a heart for it. They are following us. They are looking for some way. I was one of those. You sit there and you're in mainstream media trying to figure out ways to just sneak at least some part of the information out because you care about it. And you risk your career every time you do. And I think it's just, you know, papers may be a little bit different than sort of news media on television. But we have a real problem. I mean, media is really, really in trouble. And if those journalists don't figure out how to talk their, you know, the editorial boards into moving in this direction, we're in trouble.
And I was going to add, I mean, I understand what you're saying, Jennifer, and I think that that's probably very true. Journalists would like to, they're afraid. Medical ethicists will always tell me, you know, they'll say, you know, there should be mandates, right? Or there shouldn't be, but mostly there should be. And I ask them, and I realize that they accept vaccines are safe and effective, and they've never looked at the actual studies themselves. That's what's going on here. And with the journalists, that yes, some are afraid because they really they're afraid that they're going to cause an outbreak and they don't understand. But I'm sorry, most of the articles that I read and the stories are actually, that's not what's going on. Because I read articles or I'll hear interviews where they're not even covering the issue. They're saying, you know, I'll look at a pertussis outbreak in Minnesota or in my own neighborhood, and I talk to the school nurses. It's 100% vaccinated kids, right? And then the newspaper will cover it, and then at the end they'll say, Dr. So-and-so from the health department said that the unvaccinated, the people choosing to not vaccinate are the cause of it. And I'm like, you just reported they were all vaccinated. Why are you repeating this? Are you stupid? I mean, can you be that stupid? So so I think that it's more than that. I think there's a lot of pressure. I think there's a lot of ghostwriting and astroturfing that's going on. And I know with NPR, they'll interview, you know, somebody at the CDC about the 63,000 deaths and not bother to actually read the article that came out in the New York Times. And not only that, I wrote a chapter, and it's in your handout, I wrote a chapter for a book that was published for a law professor at NYU. And I looked at the research that the CDC was using to say that flu shots should be mandatory for healthcare workers. And I looked at the references they cited. And the references they cited had nothing to do with what they said they were. One was actually another page at the CDC saying they recommended it. That was their scientific reference. Another one was a study in Japanese pregnant women with viruses. It had nothing, I mean, like if you bother to actually read as a physician and look at the references, you'll see there's a lot going on here that's a problem. Today, just a few days ago, the CDC came out and said, you know, that the HPV vaccine is safe for pregnancy. And they were basing that on a study that looked at women who had gotten the HPV vaccine and was pregnant 6 months or later after that. So now they're extrapolating it, saying it's safe in pregnancy. Okay? But as a physician, you read that the CDC says it's safe in pregnancy. You don't bother to look at what they based it on. Just like the DPT shot, safe in pregnancy. But it was based on giving it they were saying, well, first, the amount of pregnancies is almost 18%. The amount of miscarriages is 18%, right? In the first trimester. But in the third trimester, it's less than 5%, right? But they looked at and they said the overall miscarriage rate for women who got the DPT during pregnancy was 18%. And when did they give it? They gave it in the second and third trimester. 18% is not the miscarriage rate in those trimesters. It's in the first trimester. But as a physician, you read the synopsis and you say it's safe. And as a journalist, you read it and you say it's safe, and you just come from the assumption they're safe and effective and you're not being lied to. That's a problem. And when you're a journalist and you actually go out of your way to only interview one side or not see a movie, because my film was also reviewed by somebody who never saw it, then you're a liar.
Yeah.
And you're part of the problem.
Great. I think, are we on a hard out here? We're still going. Still good. Okay. So then Judy wants to.
Yeah, I want to add one comment to that with regard to scientific literature and scientific publications. And what happens in science, if you're a government worker or you work for a government agency and you publish a paper that dares say something about science of vaccines and other things, even back to HIV and AIDS and everything. If we said anything about that suggested viruses that women and children could get infected, that the blood supply was contaminated, what they do with those papers, if you work for the government, is you have to send them up through channels. So the CDC, the FDA, the NIH, the NIAID, everyone has to approve that paper before it goes through. So the best thing about our paper in 2009 in Science is because Frank Rossetti, because they did that to him with regard to HIV and AIDS and the isolation, and because of the problem that came with the French and the little, the virus game that got played with who discovered it and cost us an entire continent, Frank Rossetti, after 1983 or so, never ever submitted a paper through channels. So the best day of my life was October 8, 2009, with the collective, oh shit, what are we? And it took 2 years for them to retract it. And Harvey Alter validated it. Alaska Award winner, Harvey Alter validated. And the editors pulled him and said, we don't all agree with it. And they pulled it and they waited for the CDC to come up with a piece of fraud and a piece of crap and put it out to destroy the MECFS community, the patients, and make it go away. And then they did another study that was supposedly the blood supply was contaminated, but the test was done. The way the study was set up was to show whether or not we had a valid diagnostic test for it. So they turned that study into an association study, and it had 16 people in it. It wasn't powered as an association study, and it was pure fraud. And the science journalists who covered it, literally made this, an attack on patients, on honest scientists, and the government was full on in every bit of it. They look at every single one of these and they bless them. And if they don't bless them, they don't go out. And they fund everything. And so you don't do that research. It's censored because it's not funded. It's censored because it's not published. And if you get lucky, like Dr. Alter and me, and it gets published, they retract it. When they can't do anything to prove it wrong, they just pull it and throw you in jail and throw a mugshot up.
Anyone else have a question? Yeah, it was very thorough. I want to thank this esteemed panel. It's been a real treat to be able to be up here with these amazing individuals. I want to thank you for your time today. And I just want to close in saying, there's a lot of doom and gloom up here. There's a lot of scary information coming our way. But we live in a very, very positive moment. This issue has been being argued and fought for decades. Some of the powerful foundations that have been built, some of those people are in this room that have been here for a very long time fighting this. But we have a time of movement. This dialogue has become a national dialogue. Whether they like it or not, and whether the approach by mainstream media is pure attack, we know that attack is happening because more and more people, every single day, vaccine risk awareness, which is what this is growing. And once you begin asking the appropriate questions, you start a journey, and I don't remember if it was Paul or one of you said up here, you never turn back. And that's true. You never turn back. This is a movement that every day grows, and every day they're losing the truth. They're losing people. We are right. Science will go down in history. This science you're hearing today is the right side of history. And I want to warn journalists, and I want to warn doctors. It may not be your fault, your politicians. It may not be your fault in this instant. But the moment you hear about this, and you don't investigate it, and you don't do what's right, and you don't get on the right side of history, we had Nuremberg trials for people that went along with the status quo. You are not protected because everybody says it's okay. Consensus is not science. Only truth is science, and truth is a question we must constantly ask, day after day, moment by moment. We are evolving in every stage of life, science, technology. This vaccine program is not evolving, and it must, if we're to be the great nation, the healthy people of the United States and the world. Thank you very much for being here today.
I think Toni can out-talk me.